What do I do in the classroom? It's a good question. So at the moment, one of the things that drives me nuts as a teacher is that I know that the research tells us that on average, a teacher will spend more than 80% of their lesson talking. Now that for me is appalling. Uh, I know sometimes it's required, but generally speaking, research tells us that actually you need to be spending a lot less time talking and trying to get your students to do a lot more of the talking and a lot more of the thinking, because what you're producing are passive learners, and most of the time they're not great learners, people who are passive. So you don't want things to be 80% you talking to your students. And if you don't know if you're talking 80% or whatever, record your lessons and just see how you're going in terms of time spent you talking compared to how much time you hear your kids talking. But the research is very clear that 80% of class time is just a teacher talking at the students, which I don't know, it bores me. Particularly, that's a problem for me because I know that students can only focus for around 5 to 7 minutes, maybe 10 or 15, depending on how old they are. But I kind of go along the rule of 1 minute per year that they are old. So if you're dealing with kindergartens, maximum 5 minutes of you talking, otherwise they're distracted. Whereas if you have someone in year 12 who's 17, you can probably give them a 15-minute session where you're talking or explaining something and they'll be able to focus for that long. But again, they're going to be getting fatigued and tired towards the end of that. When it does come to explicit teaching, students need clear, direct instructions. You need to remove anything that is not required. As soon as you start to include stuff that's just waffle or that is not essential to what the people are trying to learn, that's when you're adding load that doesn't need to be there for their working memory. And so you need to think about, okay, make sure things are clear and direct. Your explicit teaching needs to be very expository, just focusing on what you're doing and explaining that and nothing else. Your role as a teacher is not a facilitator and guide. I know there's stuff around that being part of what we do, and it is part of it, but actually your main role is to be a leader. You are the leader in the classroom, and you are the one that helps students and coaches them and models stuff to them, more than kind of goes, oh, what do you think? It's actually more a training an athlete type approach where you know what they should be doing, you know the techniques, you know the thinking, you know the content, you know what needs to happen for them to get to a particular point. And so it's your job to make sure that you are coaching them to develop the next step, the next step, the next step. And that might be by letting them fail. It might be by stepping out and being a facilitator and trying to let them lead for a bit or whatever it might be. But overall, you are the leader. You're the one who is designing how students are learning and who is programming this and setting it up for how students are going to go about their learning. So you are the coach and you also are the model. So it's your job to make sure you are doing nice, clear, big worked examples. It is your job to show progressive steps with opportunities for students to then assimilate to what you're doing. So if you're working through a maths problem, you do this step, students do it. Next step, students do it. And you're doing that worked example. And then you might do another one as a complete and then get them to have a go. And then you might do a half one and get them to finish it. And that's really you progressively stepping them towards where you want them to be with their learning or with their skill or whatever it happens to be. Now, I'm from a PE background, so coaching and modeling makes really good sense to me in terms of my teaching as well. I know where they're at, I know where I need to get them, and I know the steps in between. And so it's my job to say, okay, this is where you are, this is what needs to happen. And how you decide to design what you do in the classroom to get them to what they need to get to, that's fine. You can do that from a million different ways. But your job is to design and coach and model and get them up to where they need to be. Students need to do lots of deliberate practice. And as an educator, I really like to promote flipped learning because that will free up a lot of time in your class for your students to do deliberate practice. And that actually means that they're going to get lots of really good feedback from you as they're doing it. So deliberate practice requires guidance, it requires goals. So you should have some learning goals for your students that you've set with them. And then your instructions on what they need to do to get there. Students then practice. And the practicing is what should be really happening in your classroom a lot. Lots and lots of practice where kids fail, where you accept their failures and where you give them feedback. So that feedback is really key for them to then go and improve and get ready for the next steps. So guidance, goals, instruction, practice, and feedback are key for deliberate practice. Now, there are some essential components of learning sequences. Now, you can add stuff into this and elaborate aspects of it and spend more time in one spot than another. But essentially, if you're going to learn something, you need to kind of follow these steps to get it. So there's essentially like an initial review of what do I know, where am I at in terms of what's going on with this content. So that's finding what your prior knowledge really is. Your formal presentation of new content, that might be through a video, it might be through an explicit PowerPoint presentation, it might be students reading something, it could be any number of ways of getting that new content. They then do guided, deliberate practice where they're going over stuff in your classroom, getting lots of feedback. That's the next step of that is essential for learning sequences. Students need practice with feedback. And then they need some independent practice as well with a follow-up review. So you're doing that cycle of practice and feedback, and then students have a go themselves, and then let's review what you actually know. Where were you? What have you learned? Where you're at now? And that helps the students to go, oh, I've learned something. I've gotten towards my goals, or maybe I've achieved that goal. And that's great for them to see, because with learning, the things that you enjoy the most are actually the goal setting and the achieving of the goals. The learning itself, no one likes because it's hard work and it requires a lot of energy. Now, when it comes to your class time, Hattie and Yates are going to say that you should spend about 1/3 of your class time on instruction, 1/3 on structured question and answer between students. So that's not necessarily question and answer where you're asking questions, they're answering, or they're asking questions and you're answering. But even between the kids, they should be talking to each other about whatever the topic is or the content or the skill that you're doing with them. And then 1/3 of monitored output. And that really is the practice, that deliberate, guided practice that your students need is that monitored output. What are they producing? And you frequently watching over it, providing feedback, helping them to improve, and then moving on. Now, as a flipped classroom person, I'll actually tell you that 1/3 of that you can put into homework and shrink down your time, because a video presentation or a chunk of reading for your students to do at home, it takes way less time. So I can actually turn a 45-minute lecture style presentation for my students into a 5 to 10-minute video that has all the same content, that doesn't have the distractions, that doesn't have me waiting for students to write notes and going backwards and forwards and checking to see if someone's got it. They don't have it. I have to go back and repeat myself. The video, they can just rewind it and watch it again. If they need to, they can pause it. And so I really promote that for them in terms of that, getting the instruction aspect. And that will then free up your classroom time. You can spend half your time doing structured question and answer if you want, and half your time doing monitored output. Because for me, I reckon 1/3 and 1/3 is probably a minimum. I want a minimum of 1/3 of my time being question and answer and 1/3 of my time being monitored output. If I can get more of my time doing that, excellent. And if I can do that by sending videos home for them to watch, even better. Now, the processes for teaching and learning, we've kind of gone over this, but I'll just kind of go through these 6 processes for teaching and learning. One is you present. So you should have some kind of outline or scaffold that kind of goes along with that. But you're going to present the new content. There's going to be instruction, so direct and clear instruction that has worked examples. That is key for your students to really get the content, is if you have worked examples for them. They need to practice, so partially completed, or because you've already done the worked examples, now give them a partially completed example and then free it up and let them go by themselves. They then do some knowledge acquisition because they're practicing that and they're actually developing that knowledge. They're getting feedback and then they're applying it. And that application, the more real world that application can be, the more meaning what they're learning will have, and the more they're going to be able to learn that information or that skill or whatever it is that you've got. If you've got all these things present, your students will learn a lot easier.